Hello, welcome back to my channel and happy Halloween, by far the greatest day of the year. Sadly, I'll be working on Halloween. Not like we can do much this Halloween because of COVID and quarantine and everything, but I hope you enjoy it nonetheless. Please don't go out and party and be stupid though. Anyways, today I'm going to be talking about satanic panic and just that whole mess. Obviously, I'm dressed like a little she-devil because we're talking about the devil. Alright, let's get into it. Oh, before we get into it, actually, please like and subscribe. I make true crime and occasionally commentary content, so if that's something you like, please subscribe. Let's get into it now. In the spirit of Halloween, today I want to discuss a case that completely unraveled and went to basically hell because of satanic panic that existed in the 1980s and 90s, and that is the disappearance of Kelly Day Wilson. First, let's do like a brief history of what satanic panic even was and why it started. So, satanic panic was this sort of phenomenon that originated in the 1980s in the United States, and it was said to be caused by a variety of tragedies and just like horrors that happened in the 1970s, like the Manson family murders, a bunch of serial killers that were active in the 1970s like Ted Bundy, Jonestown, and a slew of other things. There were also a lot of memoirs written that like spoke about the active communities of Satanism and sort of validated that there were like active satanic cults in the United States, even though there was no proof of that. These memoirs were written by former Satanists, or like they were raised in a satanic cult as a child and they were abused in the name of Satan by their parents and by the cult their parents belonged to, but they had found God and they became like an evangelical Christian and stuff like that. In conjunction, these like tragedies and events caused the good Christian American public to have a moral panic, which resulted in what we now know as satanic panic. The American Christian public believed that Satan had infiltrated their good suburban neighborhoods, and Satan's influence was in the neighbors. Their daycare workers were involved in some sort of satanic cult. There was this huge influx of stranger danger where everyone used to be more comfortable like keeping their doors unlocked, where now everyone seemed to be a threat. Like maybe someone was evil, maybe your next door neighbor was going to kill you or kidnap your children or something like that. At this time, as a result of the moral panic, Christian fundamentalism and evangelical Christianity was sort of resurging in popularity, and people were more like evangelical about their faith in response to the anxiety they felt. It was also due to a lot of the sort of popularization of serial killers in the media, whereas in the 70s there were a lot of active serial killers in the United States, whereas there probably were the same amount previously, but the media just didn't cover them or didn't put a name to them or stuff like that. And they attributed the rise of serial killers of cults like Jonestown or the Manson family as sort of the devil being active and walking amongst them. Their answer in response was to sort of expose Satan and find Satan in their communities, and that just resulted in a bunch of false accusations and just widespread hysteria. It was believed that Satanists were consciously infiltrating daycares to have access to the children and involve them in sort of ritual child abuse. So this would be like rituals that involving the kids or exploiting the kids in sex work, pornography, and using them as human sacrifices. At this time in the 80s, it was now normal for both parents in the household to work, whereas the mother used to stay home. But because both parents were working, someone needed to watch the kids during the daytime, so daycares were more widely used, but this hysteria started this big panic. So obviously the evil Satan worshipping daycare workers were taking advantage of their increased access to children, and they were just doing more evil things. Satanic ritual abuse, which is abbreviated as SRA, which is the hallmark of Satanism and satanic panic, varies a lot in its definition and depends on who's defining it as to what qualifies as satanic ritual abuse. For brevity's sake, I'm going to use the definition that was proposed by the National Center for Analysis of Violent Crime, which is a sort of subsect of the FBI. They sort of collect data and research on particular violent crimes and patterns in those violent crimes, maybe domestic violence or men who kill their wives, so then they can teach workshops or stuff like that, or just send paperwork to other local precincts throughout America to teach them how to handle and what procedures to follow when they are confronted with a particular violent crime. So when satanic ritual abuse was popularized in the 80s, this sect of the FBI did research on it and sort of created a document addressing if your local precinct you get the allegations of satanic ritual abuse, what procedures do you follow, what qualifies as SRA and what doesn't, blah blah blah. I do want to note that the FBI didn't completely buy into the hullabaloo of satanic ritual abuse, but in the document, which I will link below for you to read if you want to, because it is an interesting read, they do sort of allude that it could be real, but they don't know. Anyways, in the document by the FBI, they sort of define satanic ritual abuse using the definition that was given in a memoir called Michelle Remembers, which was sort of the first biography that followed a former satanic or a former child that was raised in a satanic cult. So Michelle Remembers was co-written by Michelle and her psychologist, who's Canadian sadly, and the psychologist that worked with Michelle sort of used hypnosis to recover these repressed memories from her childhood in which she was in a satanic cult, and this is sort of what popularized satanic panic and added validity to it, because it was a doctor that was sort of legitimizing these claims. It has been proven that everything in Michelle Remembers is completely falsified. The memories that they recovered were false memories, so it never happened. And Michelle and her psychologist married after, which is a complete no-no, and helping professionals, you're not supposed to marry your clients. It's super weird. Anyways, so the definition of SRA as provided by Michelle Remembers is, quote, repeated physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual assaults combined with the systemic use of symbols and secret ceremonies designed to turn a child against itself, family, society, and God. It emphasizes that, quote, abuse, like sexual assault, has ritualistic meaning and is not for sexual gratification. The FBI made sure not to include rituals that were associated with other sort of pagan religions and other older religions, such as Santeria, witchcraft, and voodoo in their explanation. So their understanding of satanic child abuse or satanic ritual abuse, it had to be specific. Satanic symbols and ceremonies and artifacts and doctrine had to be used in these rituals. I don't really know what they considered to be satanic versus not satanic. Did they consider there was an upside down cross, then it was a satanic ritual, or if it had a pentagram, which is also used in a lot of pagan religions, was that satanic? I feel like their understanding of Satanism was, and the occult relied heavily on the Hollywood understanding of Satanism, their sort of tropes and gimmicks, wild sex orgies in the forest, human sacrifices, cutting a baby, stuff like that, eating people. I feel like that's what they thought Satanism was. So after the roots of moral hysteria that took root or began in the 1970s, the 1980s started this whole daycare hysteria phenomenon. There were mass reportings and allegations of daycare workers that were involved in satanic cult, and that they were using the toddlers and the babies that they were supposed to take care of in their satanic rituals. The sort of working theory for satanic panic was that the satanic cults that existed in America had sort of infiltrated like a network of daycares throughout America, knowing that they'd have access to these children. So essentially they were all in cahoots with each other. They were all doing this together. It was one big like network of Satanists that were infiltrating daycares. So I'm going to briefly explain the first known accusation of the daycare Satanism. So the origin of the daycare accusations can be traced back to McMartin Preschool, which is located in Manhattan Beach, which is in California. One mother whose son attended the McMartin Preschool came forward to the police to make allegations that her estranged husband and a daycare teacher at the McMartin Preschool had both sexually abused her child. It's unknown if the child ever like validated these claims or if he denied them, but it's said that she sort of believed that her son was being sexually abused after he had trouble with his bowel movements. This mother went on to make more crazier accusations about the preschool workers, saying that the daycare staff had sex with animals, one worker drilled a hole under a child's arms, and that another teacher had the ability to fly. This mother was later diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. But these accusations before her diagnosis resulted in the local police station sending out a letter to around 200 families that had attended the McMartin Preschool and informing them about the allegations that had been made about sexual abuse and asking the parents to question their children about if they had a similar experience. A therapy abuse clinic was enlisted to help interview the children who went to the daycare. The lady who was sort of in charge of these interviews had no formal like medical or psychological training, so she was like kind of like just anyone off the street could have done it sort of thing. It was later found that these interviews were completely unethically done. The interviewers had actively worked to plant these sort of false memories in the brain or in these children so they could just repeat what they wanted them to say essentially. This resulted in 360 children who had gone to the daycare claiming allegations of abuse. It was later reduced to 41 children who testified in court. The accusations sort of started getting weirder and weirder. It began with the children just like recounting normal sexual abuse, and then it just went completely batshit. Included in the accusations were that children alleged that the daycare workers would flush them down the toilets, fly in the air, involve them in sexual satanic rituals. They traveled in a hot air balloon for some reason. Don't really know why that's in there. They sacrificed and they witnessed a sacrifice of a baby for like some different ritual. They also claimed that underneath the McMartin Preschool there was like a network of tunnels and stuff that they would use to like transport the children from the daycare to this like underground room where they would conduct the satanic rituals. Obviously this underground network of tunnels didn't exist. These allegations resulted in the conviction of numerous people in the McMartin family based on this sort of ludicrous testimony. Anyways, I could ramble on much longer about the whole McMartin trial and such, but I just wanted to give you a basis or a jumping off point of what the allegations around satanic panic looked like. After the McMartin case and a bunch of other allegations throughout the United States, many bought into the whole conspiracy that there was a web of satanic cults that were active in America. Eventually, the hysteria spread to a small town in Texas called Gilmer, which is where our story begins. To me, a complete outsider who's never been to Texas or Gilmer seems like just this sort of small and unassuming town, just pretty normal, but this sort of all seemed to change in 1990. Kelly Day Wilson was born on May 18th, 1974 to parents Robert Wilson and Kathy Carlson. Sadly, not a lot is known about Kelly's early life. I do like to sort of paint a picture and give as much information and insight into how these victims were before the tragedy that happened to them, but there's not a lot available. All that is known is that she was currently a senior at a local Gilmore high school and that she was a cheerleader. She was last seen on January 5th, 1992 at around 8:30 p.m. She was 17 years old at the time. Kelly had just finished her work shift for the night at Northwest Texas Video, which was sort of a Blockbuster, sort of rent-a-DVD, rent-a-video VHS type store. The store had closed for the night and she had left at the same time as her manager, Joe Henry, who was the last known person to see her. He saw her sort of standing by her car and getting into it before he himself pulled out of the parking lot and drove away in his truck. Kelly had the store's money deposit for the night, and it was sort of a part of her job duties to go to a local bank and deposit the check. The money was depositive. The money was deposited, but it's unclear to me if she actually went inside a bank to deposit or if it was like this sort of drive-through deposit situation. It's different in different articles, but her car was seen on bank surveillance tapes depositing the check, but the footage is so grainy that you can't make out who's in the car or who's the person depositing the check. Kelly had told her parents that she was going to go to a friend's house after work, but she never made it. Her mother and her stepfather began to panic when Kelly didn't return home from work or her friend's house later that night. Early the next morning, her stepfather drove out to her workplace and noticed that Kelly's car was still in the work parking lot, and when he got out to check, he saw that the tires on her car had been slashed, so he called 911. Kelly's mother then called Kelly's boss, Joe, and asked him if Kelly had mentioned anything about plans or where she was going or was planning to spend the night. Joe said Kelly didn't say anything to him. It is believed currently that it was Kelly who went to deposit the check at the nearby bank, but somehow her tires got slashed, so she had to pull over in her work parking lot and got out to, I guess, check on it, and that's when something bad happened to her. After that, it's relatively still unknown what happened to Kelly. Kelly was last seen wearing a purple rugby shirt with a red, gold, and white insignia. The shirt had a white collar and white cuffs. She was also wearing blue jeans and brown loafers. Kelly had blonde hair, but her natural hair was brown, but she had bleached it, but the roots were starting to come in, and she had blue eyes. The Gilmore Police Department immediately launched an investigation and search for Kelly. Their search was led by Sergeant James Brown, who will come into play more later in the whole Satanic Panic stuff. There had been a tip given to James Brown that Kelly's body had been dumped in a local field, so he went out to check and search, but nothing was there. At the beginning of their investigation, there sort of seemed to be three main persons of interest. The first, of course, was Joe Henry, her manager, because he was the last to see her, so he was obviously the first to be questioned. He was formally ruled out when his alibi checked out and he passed a polygraph test. He has maintained his story that the last time he saw Kelly was when he pulled out of the parking lot in his truck and saw her sort of starting to get into her own car. The second main suspect in Kelly's disappearance is Michael Bibby. Michael Bibby was described as a local skateboarder in Gilmore, Texas. He was also only 17 years old at the time of Kelly's disappearance. Michael Bibby's sort of involvement in Kelly's disappearance was heavily reliant on the whole Satanic Panic theory that followed Kelly's disappearance. I'll explain his involvement in that a little bit more, but Michael was eventually charged with criminal mischief, which is a misdemeanor, for slashing Kelly's tires, but after that he couldn't be associated with Kelly's disappearance, so it seems he just sort of was being an ass and slashed her tires and went away, unless he was involved and he did that to sort of target her, who knows. And then there's Chris Denton, who is the prime suspect and who I believe is a pretty good candidate for who harmed Kelly Day Wilson. So Chris Denton was, I think, around Kelly's age. I can't really find his actual age, but he was said to be dating Kelly on and off at the time of her disappearance, and many described him to have a hot temper. Chris also had a prior criminal conviction for assault with a knife. Not much is known about the details of the assault. Like, I don't know if it was a former girlfriend he pulled it on, or was like in a fight in the heat of the moment sort of thing. I don't know, but he does have a history of violence. There were reports that Kelly and Chris had planned to go on a date after she got off work at the Texas video store on January 5th, which is the night she disappeared. He was also never able to give police a solid alibi for where he was that night. His cousin Brent Ward also seems to be involved somehow because he had been caught in multiple lies surrounding the whole Kelly investigation. He had asked one of his female friends to lie for him and give him an alibi on the night of January 5th into the early morning of January 6th. She obviously refused and told the police about this. It was later proven that Brent Ward and Chris Denton were actually together that night. Both boys constantly lied and seemed super shady about their what they did that night, but neither ever confessed to harming or kidnapping Kelly Day Wilson. More suspiciously, Chris's car was later sold to this local auto body shop only a few days after Kelly's disappearance. Police managed to recover the car before it was completely sent away or destroyed, and when they tried to recover forensics, they didn't really find much, but they did notice that a huge chunk of the mat of the car was missing. Someone had cut it out. As I said, police were never able to recover any forensics from the car, but Sergeant James Brown believed that Chris Denton and his cousin were involved in Kelly's disappearance, and he felt that if he put enough pressure on the boys, that one of them would eventually crack and confess. Unfortunately, this could have very well happened and the boys could have confessed, but this is literally when Gilmer, Texas went into complete hysteria and ruined the entire Kelly Day Wilson investigation. To understand the role of satanic panic and satanic ritual abuse in the Kelly Day Wilson investigation, we have to go back a few years to 1989/early 1990. The Kerr family were known to be very country folk. They lived on a property that had one sort of dilapidated house and a few rundown trailers on it where various family members live, and it was located on a Cherokee Trace Road. They were very poor, known to just work odd jobs, not to really sustain a full-time job, and they depended a lot on food stamps. The allegations of child sexual abuse began with Loretta and Wendell Kerr. Loretta and Wendell Kerr were married at the time, and the pair had 4 children. Loretta went to a local Gilmer police to report that her husband had been sexually abusing 2 of their daughters, who were around 5 and 6 at the time. Somehow, Loretta was also implicated in the child abuse allegations, even though she was the one that came forward and tried to get help for her daughters, and all 4 children were removed from the Kerr household and put into foster care. Then there is Wanda Geer, who was involved in a different child sexual abuse case regarding her own children at the time, sort of around the same time, 1990, when the whole Wendell and Loretta thing was happening. Wanda had 5 children, but she was raising them as a single mother at the time. I'm unsure if Wanda had 5 children and she was raising them as a single mother at the time in 1990, around that time, early 1990s. She had an ex-husband, but I'm unsure if all 5 of her children were were fathered by this man, but he's not really relevant to the story. He's kind of absent. Anyways, Wanda gives a letter to CPS that is written by her brother Lucas Geer and is allegedly addressed to Wendell Kerr. In the letter, Lucas admits to having a sexual relationship, obviously it's sexual abuse, not a relationship, with one of Wanda's sons. Lucas admits to the police that he was sexually abusing one of Wanda's sons. Eventually, the charges of child abuse and child sexual abuse against Loretta Kerr were dropped, but the local law enforcement arrested Wendell Kerr on these allegations, these sex abuse allegations, in 1991. Loretta then obviously divorces Wendell and tries to get her children back. During the investigation into Wendell Kerr, the Kerr children, who are currently in foster care, also alleged that their uncle, Wendell's brother, Danny Kerr, and their grandparents, including their maternal grandmother, Geneva Kerr, had also sexually abused them. Danny Kerr had 5 of his own children with his common law partner, Connie Martin. After the allegations were made by Wendell's and Loretta's children, Danny's 5 children were taken into foster care as well. Wendell is eventually let out of jail sometime in 1991. There's different reports. Some say he was let out of jail on bond. Some say it was on probation. I'm unsure. But either way, he starts a romantic relationship with Wanda Geer, and the two eventually get married. And Wanda Geer becomes Wanda Kerr. So now she's part of the dreaded Kerr family. So when CPS finds out about their marriage, they remove Wanda's 5 children from her care and put them into foster care. And instead of divorcing Wendell to get her kids back, she just gives up all parental rights. The Kerr children also started accusing a few of their parents' friends of sexual abuse, so their children were also taken into state custody. I believe in total 16 children were eventually removed from their homes and taken into foster care and state custody because of the Kerr children allegations. In many of these cases, there was actual physical evidence corroborating that there was sexual and physical abuse done, especially against like Danny Kerr and Wendell Kerr and Wanda. There was a lot of physical abuse, but as the case goes further and further, the accusations just start spiraling into complete hysteria and complete just weirdness. And this was because of the corruption and the sort of misguided nature of a lot of the social workers and helping professionals that were supposed to be caring for the Kerr children and the investigators involved in the Kelly Day Wilson whole shenanigan thing. The initial comment that actually sort of spiraled the helping professionals that were taking care of the Kerr children into satanic panic, they totally believed that the Kerr family was in a satanic cult after this comment, was when one of the children, one of either Wendell or Wanda's children, I think it was Wanda's children, said, quote, Daddy, he's referring to Wendell, Daddy said that if we go into the woods, the devil would get us. To me, many parents use a sort of like God-devil dichotomy as a sort of just like fear to make their children do what they want. So to me, this is just like they didn't want their children going into the woods, so they sort of tried to instill fear into them and be like, don't go into the woods or the devil's gonna get you, sort of thing. It doesn't mean they're Satanists. They are awful people, as it is proven they are, but they're not Satanists. But the psychologist working with the Kerr children now believed that all these children were the victims of satanic ritual abuse. After the children, the Kerr family children and their friends' children were removed from their homes, they were put into therapeutic foster homes. One of these foster homes was run by a married couple, James and Marie Lapp. James and Marie were employed by the American CPS as a therapeutic foster home, which specialized in a treatment called holding, and they specialized in the just taking care of abused and traumatized children. So the technique of holding is highly controversial, and as someone who is working or is training to work in the child welfare system, I completely denounce it and see it as just like an evil abusive practice. In essence, holding is when an individual working or caring for a traumatized youth is trying to make a connection or association bond with the child. So this caring adult can be a foster parent, a social worker, something like that, an adoptive parent, though it's commonly done mostly by foster parents. So they intentionally trigger or upset the child. A lot of people will sort of verbally abuse and yell at the child until they completely break down and cry and just feel all this hurt and rage, or they put them in physical discomfort or pain until for like extended periods of time, sometimes hours at a time, until the children break down. The goal is to have the children be so emotionally wrought that they're just like hysterical. That's the goal for holding. That's the original goal. And then when they are hysterical, the youth is forced to relive or talk about the traumatic event that happened to them. For instance, if they were sexually abused by a parent, they will be forced to recount the sexual abuse during a holding session. And then the carer will like hold the child while they it's not a comfortable hold, it's like pretty aggressive while they recount this, and the goal is that the child is supposed to get all their anger and their hurt out about this situation, and they're supposed to completely heal from after multiple holding sessions, and then they're supposed to associate this new caregiver, like the foster parent that's holding them, with like comfort and affection, because I don't know, holding them in physical pain is supposed to make you love them. I don't know. It's literally completely scientifically unbased. It's so stupid. So as I said, this technique is sort of based on the theory that if you can get a child to express all their fear or hurt about a trauma that happened to them until they're completely wrought out or exhausted or hysterical, they will no longer be affected by the event. They will be miraculously healed, and they will feel this enormous sense of relief and love for the person that was performing the holding. This method has been scientifically proven to not work and is actually incredibly harmful to the child. More than once, a holding session has resulted in severe injury to the child, and a few times it has resulted in the death of a child. You can't force a child to get over a traumatic event by forcing them to relive it. It is proven that when you force someone to talk about or re-experience a trauma before they're ready, before they choose to, it's actually really traumatic, and it re-traumatizes them and can hinder their healing process and just make it worse. I'm not going to go into more holding. That's it in essence. It's awful, and if anyone still practices it, please get out of the child welfare system. There's enough problems with it. Please stop. I hate you. Marie and James Lapp had their own version of holding that they would use on the Kerr children in hopes that this would heal them from the sexual and physical abuse they had faced by their family. Their version of holding was that they would force the Kerr children or their foster children to run up and down the stairs until they were physically exhausted, which when you're physically exhausted, you're going to be more emotionally volatile. Then they would question the children about the abuse they experienced, while they would dig their knuckles into the child's side, which is obviously extremely painful, until the adults or Marie and James were satisfied with the children's answers. Then they would stop the holding. After the devil comment made by one of the Kerr children, the two social workers that were involved in the Kerr children case completely bought into the belief that the Kerr children or the Kerr family was a satanic cult. So during the holding sessions, they would start asking them leading questions questions about their family being in a cult, and they wouldn't stop the pain or the session until the children sort of just confessed that yes, they were in a cult, yes, they had been ritually abused by their parents, that sort of thing. It seemed that soon all the professionals and adults involved in the Kerr case completely started to buy into this theory, including police officers, except for Sergeant James Brown, foster parents, and prosecutors. The county enlisted the help of attorney Scott Lyford, who is a complete parasite in my opinion, to prosecute the criminal child abuse charges against the Kerr family and their associates. So during these holding sessions, they would ask leading questions, like multiple adults would be in the room during a holding session, and they would ask the Kerr children leading questions about satanic ritual abuse and sort of get them to confess that their parents were part of a satanic cult. So eventually during these holding sessions, the Kerr children said that they had been forced by their parents to participate in satanic rituals. They said that there was a brick building in the woods near the Kerr family property that their parents and their parents' friends would use for these satanic rituals. They did search for this brick building and they never found it because obviously it doesn't exist. Other confessions during holding sessions included accusations of cannibalism, sacrificing babies, and hooded figures doing rituals and flying near fires in the woods. They said that they witnessed numerous ritualistic murders. They were coerced into giving the names of other people involved in the cult, so they just sort of would give names of their friends or their friends' parents just to like satisfy the adults, and that obviously resulted in their children getting taken away from them. And there's actually proof that during the holding sessions, the Kerr children would give names of families that the social workers or that the adults liked in the community, and they would completely ignore the allegations against those parents. But if they didn't like a family or didn't care for them and the Kerr family named them, they would sort of use that as testimony. It's extremely obvious that these children were physically tortured and coerced into giving this testimony that was completely falsified and awful. They were only trying to please the adults that were physically harming them and, in my opinion, abusing them. But Scott Lyford and his team took this as evidence of Satan's presence in Gilmer, Texas. So now I'm going to talk about how the satanic panic sort of got in the mix of Kelly Day Wilson's investigation. Scott Lyford and his team of investigators enlisted two satanic specialists. They were supposed to be specialists in satanic ritual abuse to help in their case, and then they decided to broaden their satanic scope into Kelly Day Wilson's investigation. They theorized that Kelly Day Wilson had been kidnapped and murdered by an evil satanic cult that had settled in Gilmer, Texas. Now they needed someone else to testify to their new theory about Kelly Day Wilson. So they got one of the children who had already admitted that their parents were Satan worshippers in a holding ceremony or therapy. I don't know if it's I think it wasn't a Kerr child, but I think it was one of their friends' children that said this. Anyways, this little boy was only 7 years old, and he spent the entire day basically in a holding session. And during this holding session, they would ask him questions about Kelly Day Wilson. Obviously, this little boy knew who Kelly Day Wilson was because the case was huge in Gilmer, Texas. The town or the city only had a population of 5,000, so this was huge news. So obviously he knew who she was. Anyways, eventually this child, in his fear and pain, told the adults holding him that he had witnessed Kelly's murder and that she had been murdered by the Kerr family cult. Sergeant James Brown, who was in charge of the Kelly Day Wilson investigation, sort of found out about what Scott Lyford and his satanic investigators were sort of doing to the investigation, and he confronted Scott and told him to stop, that he was messing with the investigation, that these accusations were completely false. So Scott and his team, in either an attempt to silence James or because they actually thought this was an admission of James's guilt. They sort of got testimony or coerced testimony out of people to say that Sergeant James Brown was a member of the Kerr family cult, even though he had no association with the family. To just get him out of the way, that's what Scott Lyford and his team did. So he used Connie Martin for this testimony about Sergeant James Brown and just the murder of Kelly Day Wilson by the satanic cult. If you remember, Connie Martin was the common law partner of Danny Kerr, who is the part of the Kerr family and has allegations of child sex abuse against him. Connie Martin was extremely young at the time. She was early 20s, 20 years old sort of at the time, and she had a very low IQ. And as is seen repeatedly over and over in history, it is easier to manipulate someone with a sort of learning disability or deficit. So that's why I believe they got Connie Martin to admit to the testimony, because she was easier to coerce and trick into it. Connie was facing her own accusations of child abuse and sexual abuse against her own children, and she was told by investigators that her testimony in the Kelly Day Wilson murder would help her own case. Basically, this was her way out. Essentially, Connie was interviewed for 10 hours and was coached on what to say. She later admitted that she was struggling so much with the testimony during the 8 hours that the team of investigators literally wrote word for word on a board what she had to repeat. The audio was only being recorded, the video was not recorded, so they just wrote on the whiteboard, say this, and then she would say it, and that was her testimony. Eventually, this was her sort of testimony. So according to Connie, the Kerr family cult included Wendell Kerr, Wanda Kerr, Geneva Kerr, Danny Kerr, herself Connie Martin, Tammy Jo Smith, Roger Don Holman, and Sergeant James Brown. Roger Don Holman and Tammy Smith are sort of family friends of the Kerr family that children had also been taken away because of the accusations, and Roger had his own history of abusing children. Connie testified that the Kerr family cult had kidnapped Kelly from the video store parking lot. They had enlisted the help of Michael Bibby to slash the tires. That's how he's involved in this. They had enlisted him to slash the tires so she would be forced to pull over in the parking lot and they could kidnap her. Michael Bibby isn't implicated in the murder or kidnapping after this point. He was just enlisted to slit her tires, then call them, tell them that she was ready, and then leave, I guess. I don't know. And so after kidnapping her from the parking lot, they brought Kelly out to the woods near the Kerr family property. They tortured her for 10 days in the name of Satan. She was repeatedly sexually assaulted and degraded by the group. Geneva Wilson was apparently appointed the high priestess, so essentially she was sort of in charge of the rituals and the abuse. She was the one ordering the abuse of and torture of Kelly. So she directed the repeated sexual assault and torture, and then eventually Geneva stabs Kelly to death, cuts off her breast for some unknown reason. It's not explained why she did that, I guess just because Satan. Then ordered the men to hang Kelly's body from a tree so that her blood could pour out and they could collect it in a pot so they could have a blood drinking ceremony. And then they chopped up her body, cooked it, and ate it. I'm only sort of explaining this death of Kelly Wilson in detail and grotesque detail because it never happened. I just want to explain to you how absurd the accusations were and how it was so to me Hollywood horror movie of a satanic cult, what you think they do. They watched some movie, the investigators, and then they just sort of theorized and forced Connie to testify that was what happened. It's so absurd. 7 of the 8 cult members, only excluding Connie Martin because they needed her testimony in the trial, were indicted and arrested on the charges of kidnapping, raping, and murdering Kelly Day Wilson, even though they still had no body and no forensic evidence. Lyford and his associates continued to push the narrative that there was a thriving satanic cult in Gilmer. The small town became split, half believing that this whole conspiracy was true and half believing that it was just like buffoonery. Eventually, all the charges against the Kerr family satanic cult, including Sergeant James Brown, were dropped when it came to the judge's attention about the coercion of the Kerr family children and Connie Martin in their testimony. This is really upsetting to me because the evidence was so tainted because of what Lyford and his team did. The allegations of child sex abuse against like Wendell Kerr and Danny Kerr, of which they had physical proof. They had to drop all the charges because the evidence was so tainted and they couldn't sort of differentiate between what was true and what was false. So Lyford, in his attempt to be the town hero and like save Gilmer from Satan, completely messed up this whole investigation. There is ample physical evidence proving that multiple members in the Kerr family were sexually abusing their children, including Wendell Kerr, Wanda Kerr, Geneva Kerr, Eugene Kerr, who is Wendell's father, and Danny Kerr. It is, I have to say, alleged. It is alleged that both Geneva and Eugene, who had 6 children, including Wendell and Danny Kerr, had physically and sexually abused all of their children. Then it is alleged that Danny and Wendell went on to then have their own families and sexually and physically abuse their other children. There is no accusations of abuse in the other 4 Kerr children that went on to have families and marry. Resulting from the deplorable actions of many social workers and Lyford, many guilty, in my opinion, allegedly guilty predators escaped punishment. It also completely distracted from the real and legitimate investigation that Sergeant James Brown was doing in the Kelly Day Wilson disappearance. Perhaps he could have solved it if Lyford and his satanic crew hadn't interjected and completely derailed the investigation. Another tragic thing happened because of this case. One of Connie and Danny's sons, who had been sent to the therapeutic foster home that practiced holding by James and Marie Lapp, sustained irreversible brain damage after a holding session. In the session, he had refused to run up and down the stairs anymore, so the foster parents, James and Marie Lapp, had repeatedly smashed his head into the floor and until he was unconscious. His siblings witnessed the whole thing and later had to testify to this. Then instead of calling emergency services right away, James and Marie waited an hour until they called an ambulance to help this child out. I'm not going to name him. So by the time he got medical attention, it was way too late. From my knowledge, he had remained on like a drug-induced coma because his brain damage was irreversible and so bad. I'm unsure if he's still alive or on life support. After this event, James and Marie Lapp obviously were under incredible scrutiny and got their own children taken away from them. They both completed suicide. So this entire story is a complete tragedy. I sort of wanted to do a more lighthearted, if true crime can ever be lighthearted, like Halloween-y case, but it turned out to be just incredibly depressing and sad. It sort of exemplifies why bringing unwarranted conspiracy theories and faith into legal proceedings and child welfare systems is really dangerous and ill-advised. To this day, Kelly's body has never been found. Her on and off again boyfriend, Chris Denton, still remains the prime suspect, and I believe he is a very viable suspect. Unfortunately, Chris Denton did pass away from cancer in 2004 without ever confessing to Kelly's murder or kidnapping. So if you have any information about the disappearance disappearance of Kelly Day Wilson, please call the Gilmer Police Department, who are still in charge of her case. Their phone number, which I will also leave below, is 903-843-5545. So that's it for this video. I'm sorry it was more depressing than I anticipated, but child welfare, obviously I'm training to work in the system and try to make it better because it is so flawed, is a huge passion of mine. So for me, it's a good story to share and a good warning. So happy Halloween. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please like and subscribe. I'll see you next time.